Hey, my name is Daniel Yang, and I'm a part of the Chicagoland Church Planning Alliance, and I'm here with Katie Gina. And we're really excited to kind of really help you think through some of the things that the Chicago 77 project, which is a project that we're going to talk about, how that's going to be helpful to you, especially if you're involved in church planting, and especially if you're helping organizations and networks plant churches. Really, the inception of this project was as the Chicagoland Church Planning Alliance began coming alongside other church planting networks and those who lead church planting organizations, denominations. We began to kind of sense that there was a gap in data. And so, Katie, you know some of the folks because through the course of this research project, you've met folks from New Thing and from Ignite Church Planting and from Send Network, Send High Point, and various Chicago partnership. These were organizations that through the alliance we were wanting to serve, and part of the conversations that would continuously emerge is, what's the state of church planting like in Chicagoland? So, actually, about 2 years ago, we commissioned a basic study called "The State of Church Planting in Chicagoland." But increasingly, the question really became like, how are we doing in the city proper? And specifically around the community areas or the neighborhoods, the 77 community areas in Chicago. So over the last year and a half or so, the question has been, how are we doing in terms of church planting in these specific neighborhoods? So we started thinking through what kind of resource would be most helpful to those who lead church planting networks and organizations, and thought that the best kind of frame of of time would be to look at the last 10 years of church planting.
Yeah.
So specifically from 2010 through the present, but specifically through 2020. And I'm sure as you'll talk in just a second here, that kind of is it cleanly lines up with like U.S. Census data and those kinds of things, CMAP data. And so we're hoping to have a discussion here in our subsequent videos to help you better understand the Chicago 77 project, why the project came about, why it's going to be useful for you, especially if you're involved in church planting. But hey, Katie, I would love for you to just talk about like the project in general, what it's been like, and then some of the methodology that you use because you're the lead researcher on this project. In this first phase, and again, we actually published the report, the preliminary report on leadthecity.org/Chicago77. But if you can talk about like what went into that, what is it, and some of the data sources that you used.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we started off this project, the first task was to try to identify as many churches in Chicago proper as we possibly could. And so what I had to first do is just to locate as many churches as I could find. So I used Google Maps, Facebook, and then I also used the IRS. They have a 501c3.
She knows if you guys are paying taxes. All your nonprofits, but...
Yeah. No, so there's a list of 501c3 organizations that the IRS has, and you can filter it by Chicago, which is really helpful. And then also CMAP, which is the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. And that didn't really give me church names or information as much as it did information about the community areas, their demographics, things like that. And so once I had that information, the demographic information about community areas, and then the church information, I was able to, kind of make some conclusions from there.
Now, for those folks who aren't like researchers like you and I, like that just sounds like a bunch of data sources. But it's important that you'll understand like that particular approach because your first step was to try to come up with like the number of churches in existence in Chicago proper.
Yeah.
And there's no easy data source to go to. And so some of the ones that you listed, range from Google Maps to the IRS data to Facebook. And so, I mean, why? So help folks understand as we were going through this project, why is Facebook? Why was that a viable source for validating churches?
Yeah, so like you said, there's really no one list of churches in Chicago. ARDA, the Association of Religious Data Archives, I
Yep.
think it is. They have a list, but it is a bit outdated as far as we can tell. But it still has some. But we wanted to
And it
try to
was like
make.
based in Cook County, which
Mm,
most of Chicago is in Cook County, but
yeah.
Cook County is much more than just Chicago.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the other problem. And we also wanted to get as many as we could. And we also wanted to include maybe more of the churches that might be a bit more difficult to find. For example, there are some churches, some immigrant churches, for example, that might not have their own website, but they have their own Facebook page. And so Facebook doesn't really give you a start date of the church, but it gives you a start date of when the Facebook page was started.
Hmm.
And normally those aren't, earlier than 2010 or something, but at least then okay, this has been in existence for more than say a year, or it was in existence as of 2020.
Yeah. And I mean, I think if I remember correctly, I think you found a list of close to 1,900 churches in Chicago proper.
Yeah.
Which, and if you compare that to the county list listed in the ARDA, I think the ARDA, I don't remember the exact number, but it was like 2,300. So,
Yeah.
like the lists were not far off at all.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
again, in research talk, like this is important for you all to understand because some of the data points that we discovered in it, is based off of like our methodology, how we actually counted churches. And that's so you actually have a list of like close to 1,900 distinct church names,
Yes.
just so folks understand. And then you took that list and then did you plot it? I mean, how did you figure out like how many neighborhoods there are or how many churches are in each neighborhood?
Yeah, so this was kind of this was the hard part about it a little bit. All the churches that I found, I didn't always find a start date with it, whether through Google Maps, Facebook, websites, IRS. So we were able to identify the church usually and the church address. So I was able to tell, okay, as best as I can tell from the data, I think this is the community area where the church is in. And I found that out actually. What I would do is I would go on Google Maps and I would search for churches in X community area.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when the churches would pop up. I would make sure they were in the boundaries, all of that. So that was good because I have the church name, I have the church address. But I don't know if that's an old address. I don't know if that's an address that isn't in use anymore. And so there are some challenges with that, but overall we were able to get a pretty good idea of maybe how many churches were in each community area.
Yeah. So one of the things that we want to do is also help bring some of these data sources that are reliable and helpful to those who lead church planting organizations. And CMAP was one that you came across that has been really helpful to understand, like, what is the state of the demographics in Chicago. Can you talk about CMAP a little bit?
Yeah. So CMAP is the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. And what they do is that they use the Chicago 77 community areas, and those are the official borders that the city uses to collect data. And then they use those to make neighborhood scale snapshots. So basically what that means is if you go to CMAP, if you go to community areas, there's a big list of all the 77 community areas in Chicago. And you can click on each one, and it will give you a big list of really great data. And that includes, like population, race and ethnicity, age, education, language, nativity, household size and type, income, and then there's a bunch of other data that we didn't use, but that is really helpful and I think would be helpful for church planners if they want to look at it.
So, like, let's say, for instance, if somebody wanted to find out, like, what was the average household type of a neighborhood, could they find that at CMAP?
Yeah, yep, yeah.
Or if they wanted to find out, like, which neighborhood tends to fall in the category of, like, a lot of young professionals, could they find that through CMAP?
Yeah, at least with age, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can find, I think you can also find things about transportation and cars and things like that as well.
If you had a question around, like, okay, so, we're in 2020, but what are the changes, like, year by year? What have we seen in terms of demographic changes in Chicago? Is there a way to use CMAP to do that?
Yes, there is. Yeah. So their racial and ethnic data, they at first just lay it out from 2015 to 2019 is the most recent data. So the first few pages are just laying it out like that. But then as you get near to the end of each community area report, they talk about the transition of the data through time. And one of that is race and ethnicity. So you can see, I think it's at 2000, 2010, and then 2015 to 2019. And so you can see the racial and ethnic changes.
Yeah, which is pretty interesting because I think anecdotally, for those of us who live in the city, you kind of see the change of residents over time. So if you're in Logan Square is becoming whiter with time.
Mm.
It was, a very Hispanic neighborhood. And so, but then CMAP's going to help you understand to what percentages and to what levels that you're seeing these changes.
Yeah.
So, well, really cool. Well, I'd love for you to just, share with us some of the data points that you thought were interesting.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
spent, several, hundreds of hours kind of pouring over through the stuff. So, what did you learn, and what do you think is useful for those of us who lead church planting?
I discovered my love of spreadsheets.
Oh, there,
But
yeah.
other than that, the first thing that we found is there are at least 137 new churches that were started since 2010 and are still in existence as of December 2020. Again, these are best estimates that we had with the data we could find. But as far as we can tell, there's 137 new churches that have been started from 2010 to 2020.
Hmm.
There are also 5 community areas that we found that were the most underserved by churches. And what we mean by underserved, and I don't know, Daniel, maybe you can talk a bit more about this, but how we define underserved is that there are less than, I believe it was one church to 1,000 people, 10,000 people, I think it was. Yeah.
Yeah, and a part of this project, I think, also is because we're in the first phase. In our subsequent phases, we're going to try to figure out better how to come up with that definition underserved. Right now, we are using church to population ratio,
Mm,
but that only gets at one dynamic of how you can tell if a neighborhood is underserved by churches, right?
yeah, yeah.
And so a part of our next few phases is to try to come up with a better way to quantify and to understand, better definitions of underserved. So,
Yeah.
yeah. But for now, that's I think what we use for the preliminary.
Yeah, so what two of the most community areas that were the most underserved by churches are Lakeview, and it has about 2 churches for every 10,000 people, and then Brighton Park, which has about 2.2 churches for every 10,000 people. We found that the largest community area is near North Side. It has 2.7 churches for every 10,000 people. Its population is 105,481 people. And then we also found that since 2000, Englewood has seen the greatest population decline, and that near North South has seen the greatest population growth. Englewood has declined by 39%, and near South Side has increased by 202%. We also found that community areas where Spanish is their majority language, which basically means that Spanish is the majority language spoken at home, are among the most underserved churches. We also found that West Ridge is the most ethnically diverse community area in Chicago. There are only 3.5 churches per 10,000 people in this neighborhood.
Those are really helpful data points because I think in some ways, if you're a church planter or somebody who's leading a church planting organization, you don't always know exactly, number one, where the kinds of churches you plant, where you might actually have the most effectiveness in reaching, the people of that community. So I think some of these stats that that we were able to discover can help people kind of think better through that. Now you just pulled a few. The full report has actually much more than that. You have a bunch of data tables, but these are some of the major findings. And in subsequent videos, I'm actually going to have a conversation with Oscar Leyva, and we'll dig into some of these. And he's a church planter, in the Pilsen neighborhood. And I'm actually going to interview him. He's going to interview me, and we're going to unpack some of this data, like really at the ground level. But one of the things that I think a lot of folks want to know is like age demographics. And so one of the neighborhoods is, a very young neighborhood. Can you talk about that one?
Yeah, absolutely. We found that Riverdale has the lowest median age. Its median age is 23.1, and it has 6.89 churches per 10,000 people.
Yeah, and that's, again, we'll have some more discussion around that. But the age dynamics of Chicago and specifically, West Ridge Riverdale is predominantly African-American neighborhood. you actually see that we talked about this with Englewood, that there is a black flight from the city that's pushing to the margins and the edges of the city proper. So a lot of dynamics here. These aren't just numbers. This is actually the dynamics of the migration flow of residents that are already in Chicago, but then also residents that are moving into Chicago. And so I think this is going to be helpful. Again, Oscar and I will have conversations in subsequent videos to help you understand on the ground level, what does this data actually look like and what does it actually mean. But, as we wrap up here, Katie, help us to understand, again, like the how to use this data, because you're not going to be able to just punch in your zip code and okay, here's all the data you need for the zip code. So help us to, most of us that are listening here, are probably a part of the city. We're affiliated with the city. We live in the city. Some folks listening are folks who live outside of Chicago, and they're interested in maybe being a part of church planting, investing in church planters. Help them to understand what the 77 neighborhoods are about and what CMAP is about in this data.
Yeah, so the 77 community areas are defined by the city of Chicago. So they may be a little different from what people in Chicago believe that community areas are, which is a little bit challenging because sometimes when we talk to church leaders or planters, they'll tell us that they're in one community area. We look them up on Google Maps, and due to Chicago's boundaries, they're actually in another community area technically. But yeah, so each community area is defined by a certain set of boundaries. It's not just zip codes. Zip codes actually span across community areas. So even if you just type in your zip code, you will not necessarily get one community area. You may get 2, you may get 5. It all depends on where you are. Yeah.
Cool. That's really helpful. Well, Katie, thanks for your work on this. I know we got phase 2 that's coming up soon. Can you talk about phase 2 real quickly and, the idea behind this survey that we have coming out soon?
Yeah, so the whole point of gathering all these church names and addresses, and if I could find it, contact information, was to get a list of church plants in Chicago, so churches that were started between 2010 and 2020. And to try to gather that list of contact information so that we could hopefully send out a survey and just kind of develop a picture of what church plants look like in Chicago. And so we're in the process of developing that survey right now. And we're trying to confirm church plants, get their actual contact information, their actual addresses, things like that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, what we want to do is take that information that we've learned from church plants since 2010 and be able to help you understand the state of church planting and how better to think about church planting moving towards the future. So phase 1 was this preliminary report where we had, a look at CMAP and to try to count the number of existing churches and church plants. Phase 2, which will kick off in the new year, is going to be this survey that we'll roll out to better understand how churches were being planted during that decade period. And then really moving forward, kind of in the phase 3, what we want to do is begin to get input and better understand, not just the best practices, but how do we think better as we look towards the future of church planting here in Chicago. So really excited that you all are tuning in because we got some exciting things coming up as well. We've had a think tank that we want to host in the winter, early spring, to really come around some of the implications of the early report, and then a summit that we want to bring folks around to really begin thinking about ideation around church planting innovation in Chicago. So thanks for tuning in, and be sure to catch the next 2 conversations that I'll have with Oscar Leyva, and we come around some of this data and what it actually looks like on the ground as a church planter. Thanks again.